Welcome to another episode of Radio Myles, a podcast designed to intrigue, entertain, and perhaps, hopefully, change your perspective on the figure known mostly as Flann O'Brien or Myles gCopaleen, but is also known as Brian Ó Nualláin. Thank you to Birkbeck College for supporting. And today I am very excited indeed to be joined by Oisín Brian Ó Nualláin's nephew, English and history teacher, literary tour guide, and a self-described madman/builder, and also a writer in his own right, working on a book about his time teaching in Muammar Gaddafi's Libya. Last year in Boston, Oisín and Deirdre Lamont performed Slína gCopaleen Gorta Hawk Here We Come at the 6th conference of the International Flann O'Brien Society. I wasn't there, but I am informed that the talk involved smells in Balbocht, the place of Gorta Hawk and the role of vendettas in Flann O'Brien's writing, and something to do with Irish gonzo. Oisín, it's an honor to have you on the podcast. Welcome. And I guess I should stress that we are here to have what is much more of a personal reflection on at least what you know of your uncle and of course your dad. It's not necessarily an academic conversation, but I just want to check, did I get that intro right? Is there anything that I'm wrong about, but you would immediately correct me on?
No, not at all. From the anarchic talk to my description is quite apt.
I did miss something. Sorry, I've not prepared my notes properly. As well as all of these things, you're a former boxer and boxing coach as well, right?
Yeah, I am. Not down in the club at the moment, so I'm more like a sumo wrestler than a boxer at the moment. What can you do?
Yeah, thanks for being here and joining me. I think this is going to be quite a significant conversation, just to put some stuff on record in some ways of speaking with a family and we'll talk about what kind of literary figure he was, but there's not so much of that, right? For when we think about Brian, there's not so much of records of the estate and the family talking. I'm going to start in an odd way around for the benefit of our listeners and ask you to give me a little portrait of your uncle first rather than your dad. I appreciate that's not necessarily the best way around for you personally, but because of a Flann O'Brien podcast, we'll start with your uncle. And then, of course, talk a bit more about your dad and how that link works. But yeah, so you obviously have I guess you didn't know the man directly, but you have a very direct link through your father, who was himself, as we'll come to, a major cultural figure in Ireland of the 20th century, a painter, cartoonist, civil servant, self-taught scientist. But first, can you talk about Brian Ó Nualláin or Brian Ó Nualláin as your uncle?
The first thing to state, just to be clear, people, is I was born in 1978, so he already deceased much earlier. So I suppose for me, it's like almost like two strains or two different people, two sides of a coin. So on the one hand, the personal, in terms of the stories my dad would play at a personal level, which weren't obviously involving his writing. It could have been talking about during the emergency when my dad was very young, Brian is showing how to grow vegetables in the back garden. The emergency in Ireland is, by the way, when we just painted our windows and we didn't have as much money and the rest of Europe was at war. So it was a bit more state in Ireland. But just strange stories about him doing DIY with Brian and stuff like that. They're very personal. My dad could get emotional when he talked about him. So that connection's quite strange because he's seen as a sort of bizarre figure in Dublin that's almost not human, but real emotions and that. My granddad would have been extremely busy in Dublin Castle and traveling for work and away a lot of the time. And when my dad was only about 9 years old, he had a heart attack and all of a sudden he was gone. Ather, that's Irish for father, was missing. And it was Brian who drove my dad and his youngest of the family, Neil, in a car and brought them for a drive and explained that he wouldn't be coming back. He took on the role of his father, really. So in some ways, I see him as my uncle in a familial way, but also as my grandfather. And my grandfather would seem like almost like a great-grandfather. Because don't forget, my dad's 20 years older than my mother. He lived till nearly 90. Despite what he tried to do to himself, it's so far back. The date, I remember when I was talking to Dad's family at his funeral and stuff, I was trying to explain to people, my father was born before the Wall Street crash. My uncle was born before World War One. The span of time is different on a personal level. But I also had, in terms of my uncle, I remember like just being a little child and helping clearing out his house And we used to go up to Evelyn, who was his wife. I used to be brought up there on a regular basis and all that. So I would have been around his house and seen his books and knowing that this uncle used to write and going around his room and looking at old manuscripts. And do you know the house they had up in Slorgan? He would have been very much there, yeah, and very conscious of it. And then the other side would have been turning up to events, my dad doing interviews at a very young age, on knowing that there was things on television that they were talking about my uncle. And I was very young, you're coming and saying, oh, who is this guy? And then, of course, I started reading bigger books quite early, because my dad would have had me reading probably ahead of, by the time I was in doing my final years in school and stuff. I studied literature and history in college. I had read years ago a lot of the books and stuff like that. When I started reading them then, which would have been probably starting around 12, 13 and through my teens, reading them then was really interesting because you could detach a little bit, but the humour at the same time, I really got that from the Nualláin family because I knew the madness of them and I knew the way they operate and the way they speak. So the voice had a kind of, on one stage personal, but then all that bizarre stuff. Like my dad would be talking about the old ancient book, the Irish books and stuff like, and the fantastical stories. So I could see what was interwoven into it. You could see the influences. At the same time, I would have been brought up to Strabane a good few times and up to Armagh, and I would have seen the relatives there and would have been brought to the house, absorbing the way they'd speak up there and that as well. So there was the writer and then there was the personal, and they overlapped a little bit, but it certainly felt like two single people. And one is like my grandfather, if that makes sense.
It will probably seem remarkable that I'm here talking to Flann O'Brien's biological nephew. As you said, the span of time is just
crazy.
It's such a, you're almost like a one generational link to someone who was born so long ago.
I remember talking to my maternal grandmother, and she only passed away there 2 years ago, but she lived till over 105. She was in her 106th year. I was always comfortable talking to older people because I'd be sitting down with my dad and he would have been the age of other people's grandfather. So I was at ease talking, and the familiarities of someone talking as if it was yesterday about 1950s or 60s politics and things that happened and a different outlook perhaps. So studying history was quite natural because I knew all the characters involved. They had been kind of nation builders. So I suppose me studying history was maybe a lazy, easy degree for me to pick up, because especially the Irish history was very vivid, very tangible. Since I was the age of 4 or 5, I was being lecturing for hours on different political and literary figures and discussions that you shouldn't be saying to a 5-year-old. I was going to the theatre because they owed money to my dad for the Brendan Behan portrait. He did a full life-size portrait of Brendan Behan, which hangs in the National Theatre now, and they owed us money. We had free ticket for years because I couldn't really pay it. I used to be gone from the age of 5 or 6 with all adult. Now, I'd be picking up bits and pieces of it, but really, what I realise now is I was absorbing things all the time.
Makes a lot of sense. So before we go any further, let's talk about your dad, right? The guy who is the link that you have. So
Yeah.
Most listeners to this podcast probably haven't even really thought about this. I know Nolan researchers know a bit more about it, but take us through who this guy was, because he's, as I said, like he's quite a major influence in his own right and did a lot of stuff that you're probably very proud of.
Yeah, he's certainly not as a bigger figure in terms of the world renown or anything like that, but he would certainly be a figure that not only from his art, but education policy and changing the education system in political discourse and taking on the governments, sometimes in very bizarre ways, whether it was in court or challenging them or making fools of them, basically. He was a very interesting, one-of-a-kind. You wouldn't forget if you met him once. You'd probably remember. Now, some people might say he could have been mad that day, he could have been grumpy, but you probably wouldn't forget. So he was a very colourful, highly intelligent, articulate man. He spoke 8 or 9 languages. They all seemed to have, within the family, not just my father, like encyclopedic knowledge, like ridiculous, bizarre knowledge on areas that you're there. How did they know that? We know there wasn't much television around. There was no PlayStations and all that sort of stuff, but a vivacious reader. So he'd be reading constantly. He'd be reading 3 or 4 books at a time. He'd be putting down patents for scientific inventions. He'd be one of the heads of Department of Education. He'd be writing speeches for the Minister for Education at the time. He'd be producing art. He'd be in the pub. I think he was like Margaret Thatcher. He'd sleep about 2 hours a night. It was just life lived at full speed, and everything had to be challenged. So he was born in 1928. He didn't really start formal education until 9 or 10. He would have been speaking in Irish primarily. That was their language. He would have been sneakily learning English off friends and people around. By the age of 9 or 10, he would have had a very good grasp of French. He would have been reading Latin. He would have been taking on some Spanish. And by the time he goes to school, he only goes to a convent primary school for 2 or 3 years. But he's already way ahead. And then his father had passed away. He went to Blackrock College. The Holy Ghost Fathers in Blackrock College, which is a prodigious private school in Blackrock here, close to where I'm sitting. They actually agreed for the last 2 brothers to be given the free education because they knew the family and they knew the circumstances. So he later thanked them with a big portrait. He donated to the college and everything like that. So he had a good relationship. He got to thank them formally and they celebrated him as well. But I suppose he would have travelled. He was a freelance he went to the Irish College of Art and Design. He got a scholarship very earlier on. And then he came out of art college and he was living in a bedsit in a bohemian sort of lifestyle. He floated around many countries in Europe, getting in a lot of trouble most of the time. I think he was arrested in most jurisdictions that he arrived in for different reasons. And he developed his languages and he was learning. He was unbelievable with language. I could remember he was 80 and he was determined to learn Basque. He got the old lingaphone, this old archaic lingaphone thing, and he was listening on his Bang & Olufsen record player because he loved classical music, so he had a nice system. But he was listening to this Basque and repeating it, and then you'd hear him go, "Fuck's sake!" He was cursing. Then he was going over to Bilbao because he Basque people over in Bilbao who had fled from Franco, their family. They were actually connected to ETA, that family. Half of them were locked up. But he was going over to meet the other 85-year-old that he'd been in school with who was Basque and to practice his Basque. And they spoke in Irish because the Basque guy actually spoke Irish, fluent Irish.
Wow.
And yeah, his father actually used to carry around Dublin. The Basque father used to go around Dublin and he used to carry a skull of the founder of ETA, of Basque separatism. And he had died during the Franco era and he used to carry the skull around Dublin. But they were settled in an Irish-speaking area in Meath. And my dad's family then hooked up with them in the school. But in the end, it was the only language that eluded him that he tried to learn. So he said the the devil tried to learn Basque and he gave up. Oh, my dad's excuse anyway. That was his excuse. But he was juggling things like Brian and a lot of his family that did many things and did other things. Which probably his art would have suffered a little bit because I suppose his most prolific period would have been the 40s and the 50s when he was traveling, when he was going out with easels, jumping on trains. And obviously then he did come back and get a teaching role where he met my mother in the west of Ireland. And then he came to the Department of Education. But I suppose that gave him a lot more time because I think he was able to just drift off to the pub like his brother and work in the civil service and be quite competent, but not spend as many hours there. So he would have had quite big in terms of his art. He would have been probably most famous for his portraiture, and there would have been several figures like Siobhan McKenna, Brendan Behan, Patrick Kavanagh. The list goes on. A lot of actors and writers of that period of the 1950s, 1960s Ireland. He would have been a cartoonist for 6 decades, which is quite astounding. He was published in all of the papers for over 60 years. I think something like 65 years. And he also had like poster art installations and a lot of different things. So he's represented in the National Gallery, he's represented in the National Theatre, National Concert Hall, institutions all over Ireland and across Europe, Canada, North America. So he was certainly interesting, and he would have engaged politically in a kind of combative way with things that he would have thought were stupid decisions or a lack of forethought, and he would have been very anti-clerical. He would have taken on the Catholic Church and their role in Ireland. He would have seen as fairly nefarious. Yeah. But he would have been ahead of his time in the attacks that he did. He would have been ahead in his time, and that's why he couldn't use his own names for his cartoon because he would have lost his job. So that's why he had to use the Kilroy. Like, yeah. So that's a rough picture, but on a personal level, he'd be extremely engaging, could be bombastic. Everything had to be discussed. So any book he had or was reading at the time had to be realised and talked through, and and the pub was no better place to do it, I suppose, you would have thought. But
whatever the audience was, whoever was there in the pub would be
and
they
didn't take any prisoners. It was just full on. So it had to be taken on board, discussed. But just I think it's word for it, but it's like when I was looking at him and his brothers and stuff, there was definitely a sense of the school teacher poem. It's something, there's a line, something to the effect of, how the students' amazement grew, that how much knowledge could be held in that little head or something like that. But you could say, I remember coming home, being in school when very young, 12, 13, and there was some obscure figure and he said, "Oh no, that's your homework." If anyone knows anything about him, and I regret asking my dad because he'd come in from the pub or something, and I asked him, and I got a 3.5-hour lecture, so it was up till 2:30 in the morning. It's this diatribe about late 1880s Fenian leader, and it was like he could just. So it was very full on, but very different, generous and supportive. Could be mad, could be truculent, as I said to you, always ready to engage in battle, whatever that may be, and looking at things from a completely different angle.
Yeah,
and I think he was dyslexic as well, and I think it ran through his family. And I have it. My brother, who's a professor in America, has it as well.
Yeah.
My great uncle would have been teaching in St. Enda's, which was, just to explain to people that might be familiar with Irish history, would be a school that Pádraig Pearse, who was the leader of 1916 Rising, he set up to basically create an Irish education through Gaeilge and with a different outlook on Irish history, a sort of precursor to independence and what we would nowadays call Gael Scullina. He was a teacher there, and then he was the vice principal, or do you call in the UK as assistant head teacher or head?
Yeah, I guess assistant head teacher.
Yeah. And I suppose so. That movement, a lot of the actual rising in 1916 as well, a lot of it was planned in that building. And when my granddad was asked to come down from his customs job in Northern Ireland, where he was based in Strabane. He also did work at crafts in Belfast, of course, as well. And he had worked in Glasgow. And he was asked to come down when the formation of the state happened. He was asked to come down, and the man at the helm of the Department of Finance at the time was Michael Collins, of course. And Michael Collins would have known of my dad's family through St. Enda's, through the Irish language movement, etc., etc. Although they weren't, perhaps, in terms of advocating armed resistance, they were very much in the cultural milieu of the new nationalism, the Irish language movement, the formation of the Gaelic Athletic Association. My granddad had been one of the first presidents of Tyrone GAA for a brief spell, studying as Ulster GAA president, and he refereed the first hurling Ulster final. So it's not just the language, the intellectual pursuit, it's also the sporting, and he was a musician as well. So there was a lot going on, but they were certainly known as a family who were high-level pro-nationalists up the north, with a lot of connections. And on my grandmother's side, so my dad's mother, several of her relatives were arrested for their involvements in national movements and stuff, and they were put on Larne and prison ships and interred in different places and that. So so there is that as well, whether I think later it develops with my dad's siblings into a sort of cultural reevaluation, sometimes through humour, sometimes through political action, is a sense that they are nation builders coming from the north. This new project is the Republic of Ireland, which would have been initially called the Free State, and later becomes a republic. When he died, he was in town writing up letters, complaining and attacking politicians or whatever. But there was a sense that, there was almost like this strange duty, but it was represented in a completely anarchic fashion or angle to attack the state. Culturally, they were well ahead of their time, and a lot of the stuff that they would have attacked or given out about or saw as ridiculous in a kind of Catholic-dominated Ireland has come to pass and has proved to be. Yeah. Certainly the change that has happened would be more in the way they would have envisaged the state, I would have said.
Yeah, so there's a kind of left-leaning progressive nationalism around the runs through the family, and it's harder to trace that in Brian. I often think it's sometimes mistaken the Crisking Lawn columns for a kind of conservatism, but I think you need to understand the nature of the opponent they're facing and the nature of clerical control and how imbricated it was in the state and state welfare systems. So you need to bear that in mind when he's whinging about or satirizing state institutions. That it's not really just the state.
And the contradiction was, and I can see why it's very confusing as well, because part of them is the Victorian, respectable householder with the hat and crombie on. So my dad had all that madness. And then at the same time, he could be almost like boorish kind of qualities in certain things. So that was definitely a contradiction. But if you look at the reality, taking on and criticizing the Catholic Church, the state and all that in a place that all it was holding on to was nationalism. We didn't have any real wealth. We were leaking people in terms of immigration decade after decade. They were holding on to this notion of we're nationalists, we're free, we're independent, when in reality, the culture policy was stifling, the economy was failing. So he was taking on these in a real way, and he could have been stronger, I'd say, in some ways, particularly in the orphanage, the fire that broke out in the orphanage. He alludes to it in Limerick and privately talked about it. But the thing is, in Ireland at that time as well, you were simply going to lose your job. He did have a lot of responsibilities. They certainly waned as he got older. But he did initially have a lot of responsibilities in terms of providing for other siblings and that.
I just want to trace back different aspects that seem to me things that haven't been very well understood or addressed so far. The family, the Nualláin family, is from County Tyrone, from around Strabane and Armagh, and that is a very distinctive place and not maybe as visited as other parts of Ireland. And it has an impact on the kind of person that the family were. And it's easy to forget, but this kind of, especially for, I'm sure the same applies to that as well, but especially for Flann O'Brien and Myles, and gCopaleen, the Dubliner, that actually that background runs very deep, and especially the situation of a Catholic nationalist family in that part of what is now Northern Ireland, but of course before the Civil War was simply just a part of the island of Ireland.
It's an area still in Ireland that would be very little visited from outside people. The areas that would have resisted, say, in the most recent conflict that we had from 69 right up into the 90s, both Armagh and Tyrone would be known as bandit country. And it was areas that the might of the British Army with helicopters couldn't fully control. But it goes back way further than that. There's been a very tough people. A lot of the best land was taken in the Ulster plantations and the 1600s. A lot of the Irish were thrown into these areas which perhaps land wouldn't have been as good. The strongest chieftains, the strongest clan and the strongest people were up and around Tyrone. The biggest resistance to many queens and kings has been from that area. And the O'Neill clan comes from there as well. So when you think of that, and then you mix in the reality of the geography, it's colder, it's tougher, it's hilly. There's not many people coming from outside. The humour is very strong. I think very strongly the mixture between their first language being Irish, which obviously leads to a much larger wealth of words and way of working with words when you're using English, which is a much more modern bastardized language. That mixture of the characteristics of the people being very tough, their humour is really important, and dry humour. There is some comedians up there, actually one or two prominent ones that are very funny, but their humour is dark. It's unforgiving. It's uncompromising, satirical, just naturally. I would think, and even though my dad was born up in Dublin, for example, and one or two of his siblings was born in Dublin and one in the Midlands and then the rest up in the north, but they're very much a northern family in Dublin. They think in a different way. They accent slightly. It's not a true Dublin accent. It's not a really posh South Dublin. It's clanged with a bit of north. They're willing to have a go at any job, and they won't stand down physically or intellectually. They're not going to stand down. It's quite, if you see how difficult it is to try and get settlements up the north and try and get the great tradition of not exactly accepting things. There could be a little bit more done on that, and their association with Donegal, that dialect of Ulster Irish was perhaps the best. And my grandfather would have really made sure that all his children went to that part to learn that exact form of Irish, which they believe is the richest form of Irish. There's three dialects. There's Connacht, Munster and Ulster. And even when they had moved to Tullamore and then on to Dublin, when they'd come, they always had a girl from the heart of the Gaeltacht in Gorkahor, and they would have brought them down to help out with the family, but more for the language. They had with the Gaeltacht there, they had a very close association all their lives. And it didn't stop it there, actually, because my dad and his other siblings would often visit the family when these were girls that they came down to help them. They'd always go up and either stay with them or meet them again. So there's a very close association with the community and the Ó Nualláin family. They didn't have any time for, it's funny, my dad didn't either, any time for, you would have seen as sentimental nonsense. All this, the great about, oh, there's a nice poor Irish peasant, how pure they are. All this poor. My uncle had said, if they like the Blaskets so much, they like to sing and fucking Yeats, why don't they fuck off and live in a rock themselves? And it's good. So basically he's saying it's grand for these gentlemen, landed gentry, to come over and record a few peasants and then hop back and write a few plays, get lauded around London. But it's one thing to do all this, but he had a genuine love of the actual, like the Isle of Man, for example, Thomas of Creanton. Different Irish writers, which he absolutely loved and had massive respect for. And a lot of them could have been just fishermen and stuff like that and farmers. So he had respect for that, but not for the sort of parodying of them, Playboy, the Western World. Like, he had no time for that kind of stuff. He just thought that and my dad, all of them were like that, thinking that they'd be more thinking about the islands should have like high-speed trains with a new invention going straight over and high-speed internet. And, they were practical in that sense because I suppose they were scientific. So they would have seen, I definitely think they would have been seeing the role of science in bettering people's lives. Like my dad was doing patents until his last patent, I think, was 87. Some of them are completely mad.
What inventions did your dad invent?
From a weeding machine where you didn't have to bend down to a giant rug, to a giant natural rug making machine where you could make this massive rug in one day. That actually that's what started a factory in Donegal, actually, near the gas. Then there was a mirrored glass kind of boxes in all different types of shapes and forms that you put in front of the television. Then you had electric poker for a porter, like for Guinness, for stout that you put in that was rechargeable. It was just bizarre. I think he had lots of. I should go to the patent office and see what's there.
That would be something. There's also something weird here, which is his like living out. I know Brian had an element of this. He proposed a new design for a typewriter, right? So he had his own ideas about patents, but of course he had the research bureau of Cuskin Lawn, which was to some extent parodying the Dublin Institute of Advanced Studies, but in another sense was actually coming up with really intriguing inventions.
Ideas.
Ideas that actually some of the ideas almost did make their way in different ways and actually are objects that we use today.
Yeah, it was interesting. Well, my dad's other one was he was trying to amplify sound to create energy using the same principles as a speaker, but controlling it in a different way. He was working on turbines till the time he died. And the other thing he was talking of dispersing clouds. So you could, to some extent, control the worst ravages of the rain, say, for example, in the west of Ireland or somewhere in Scotland. It was this idea of low-level sonic booms that would make the clouds disperse over the sea. It's funny, with my uncle's work, when I think now that the British Foreign Office have actually employed science fiction writers in a special unit to evaluate and write stories and evaluate other ideas, which, because what they've realized is loads of ideas that were laughed at or were thought were bizarre or have completely come to fruition. The Home Office and the Department of Defense in Britain have just done this. The FBI and the CIA have been doing this for decades, using science fiction writers. So there's something in it.
Yeah, absolutely. There's just something interesting about the way in which engagement with technology and modern technology was so central, and particularly the kind of engagement that you get when you are writing or working in a small nation that's to some extent economically isolated, although certainly not really culturally isolated, quite the opposite. And so that produces, it's not like you're going to go and work for IBM, right? You're then forced into these schemes and ideas that are more practical, realizable.
And not just my dad, I used to see his brothers, some of his sisters, and what they do is they'd be coming up with something. They'd say, oh, there must be a solution to that. Like, there could be silence. There'd be 2 or 3 of them drawing out schemes. How can you make this better? How can you do this?
It must be so interesting to live around all the books. Thinking of books in the library is like an extension of someone's mind. You must feel like you're in his head a bit when you're in this room.
My dad designed it, actually. This is my dad's design of me. He insisted on all these mad lines. I can show you. It's not a standard house. It's totally different. The bookshelves are central to the design. It's all completely different shapes. It's just a different type of design. But he was brilliant with the angles and we're fitting everything in.
Now you've got me thinking about the link between the kind of literary architectures of Brian Ó Nualláin and the barracks in the house of the third policeman, and the concealment of another world within its walls, and like having one customary dimension subtracted, and also the story about the kind of homemade table that at Swim was being written on in the room that your dad and your uncle shared.
Yeah.
And then later in life, much later, Brian's writing to Noel Montgomery and saying, I'm going to build another trestle table. He's asking him to help. They have a bit of an argument about it, of course, but he's asking him to help him plan to build an extension to his house. And then he's talking about this table. So there's this thing that I'm circling around, handcrafting, like the physical world around you.
Yeah, since I was the age of about 4, I was helping my dad because he'd also be doing like projects. Like he'd be making things out of wood. He didn't want me to have a gun because he didn't agree on toy guns, but eventually I was going mad. So he made me sit down with him and craft a really amazing wooden gun by hand, everything, the whole thing. But he could actually make even windows, like joinery level stuff. It was bizarre. But and again, they all could. They could all use their hands. And actually, my dad was actually really handy. If I had pictures of the old studio, his old studio was amazing, all in wood. The house we grew up in, Glenageary, that's the place where he got the awards for the idea of, he completely conserved all the heat and put in these Velux windows and made these beautiful pine. They were almost like sculpted stairs, and he opened up the whole ceilings and put in stuff. And I know he learned a lot of that off Brian. He learned a lot of his carpentry off Brian, not his dad. Brian taught him nearly all his carpentry. So he was a very handy carpentry. And he did the dovetail joints and the Tennyson's, all that stuff. I don't do it now. I just screw stuff in. You get lazy, but he'd do it right and take his time doing it right. And everything would be sanded, measured 3 times. And he would have learned a lot of that off Brian, because he used to go around copying Brian. And then there was totally different ways of building shelves and stuff, which I still do today. And he learned that off Brian, and then I learned it off him. But he in his house in Blackrock, Brian would have shown him to do stuff. They would have been doing stuff all the time. They would have fixed stuff all the time. Yeah.
And of course, Brian is the father figure of this large household. He would have had a lot of jobs to do anyway, right? So it was practical.
Yeah, it would have saved money. And don't forget, at the time, there was only really one salary coming in, his salary coming in a big household, to try and keep running that big household. And back then, you didn't get like life insurance policies. They might have just got a small little payment off the state, very small. It was probably vital to have those skills, and to train up the young lads to do it when he was at work.
Yeah.
I always thought, when I was very young, there was another, like when I was young, I just presumed Uncle Anthony, because he was bald, he used to mumble a lot, he seemed to know too much. And I just presumed he was one of the Ó Nualláin brothers, but it was actually Anthony Cronin, which would have been my uncle's biographer. And he looked very similar, he looked like one of them. And basically, I always found, when he was around, he was obviously interviewing them, my father and my aunties and the brothers and everything like that, when they were doing the biography. But I really got a sense that, like, culturally, the struggles that my uncle had with his own life and with drink later, his life eventually taken over, and the struggles that Patrick Kavanagh had, that Brennan Behan, amongst others, of that stifled time in the 40s and 50s, very early 60s. I think that one thing that came out of that was that Anthony Cronin had said he'd experienced real genius when he was talking about my uncle. In that sense, he felt like he was in the presence of genius. And he said he never wants to see artists go through this struggle again. And I think in a very real way, because he was kind of like Ó Nualláin, he would put something into a sort of like a pragmatic approach to it. And he lobbied, particularly Charles Haughey, which led to lots of arts organizations and much better appreciation for the artist, because Charles Haughey understood that we don't produce Mercedes cars, we don't produce champagne, we don't produce straws. Ireland doesn't produce much, but we do produce sculptors, painters, writers, musicians, and good Guinness. But that's really all so when he understands that, that's when you start getting the Aishdán, the Arts Council is formed, the Writers Museum opens, there's the refurbishment of the galleries first, the first one is done, and you get this kind of turnaround. And I think Anthony Cronin brought his experience of those darker days when you're seeing people stifled and in that situation where they're not supported in what they should be doing. I remember he was up to our house. I would have grown up with a lot with him, and he was at my dad's funeral in a wheelchair just a year before he died, and I had a good chat with him. And he hadn't been drinking. He was off the drink for 12 or 14 years or something. And he drank because it was the last Ó Nualláin. So he drank some whiskey and he fell out of his wheelchair, and I had to call an ambulance. He was bleeding out of his head and everything. I was there, Jesus Christ. This fellow's got so drunk, he's flew down the ramp and come off and just cracked his head open. And then he was mumbling to me, that's the last time I'll be drinking with any Ó Nualláins.
One thing that's inspirational about, to some extent, a lot of members of that generation, but particularly in the case of your family, is how many lives it's possible to live at the same time, how many roles you can perform, how many people you can actually be if you want to be.
Yeah, and very, very early you see it. And the way you just see what you copy what you realize your parents are flawed like anyone else. But at the same time, my dad could do maybe 12 different disciplines, speak 8 languages, do all this. When I was growing up, if I was saying, when I started doing building to put myself through college, I would learn it and then start reading about it and find ways to do it, and then work with carpenters the weekend and then learn it and learn how to nearly be able to build my own house, which I can do, basically build a house completely, apart from electrics. So there was a sense that I didn't have to be just a teacher. If you want to do builder, if you want to do this, if you want to write, if you want to do whatever you want to do, there's a possibility you can do multiple things. So a lot of my cousins would do multiple things. It'd be still a concurrent thing running through, I suppose, even my generation. But certainly my dad's family would have done. I can remember his 2 sisters, Roisin and Maeve, and they had retired from teaching, and Roisin was the principal. And Maeve was like a aide de camp, but she was a teacher there as well. And she was in this kind of to do nun's order. But they wouldn't take orders. And when they stopped teaching, they took off and went into the centre of 1980s Dublin, one of the roughest parts of Dublin, when heroin was ravaging the area. And they went in and just started offering free education, getting people to read and write, took a real practical approach. So they didn't sit there, they wouldn't listen to their superiors to tell them what to do. They took off and took on a different role, completely different way of teaching and different people. And then they were doing all sorts of other stuff there, like arts projects, cultural projects. All of them had that running through them. And his other brothers and stuff, they'd take on different roles or try anything. And it's probably down to learning and, I don't know, a touch of arrogance, just like a kind of thing. So my dad used to always say, nothing's impossible. And your imagination, he always used to say to me since I was a child, your imagination is your most powerful asset. That's what Oscar Wilde said. Anything imagined is real. Mm-hmm. Do you know what I mean? From that point of view. So that concept, that's probably a concept from the 1870s, the 1880s, really.
Yeah, it's actually a useful way to figure your way around what people describe as metafictional traits. Metafiction's the wrong word because it assumes you're wrapped up in a world of fictions upon fictions. It's kind of into that, but it's not really what's going on. It's much more of a, I know Brian for sure, and I'm sure your dad as well, just saw ideas as for themselves, like quite concrete things. But there's a distinction between abstract ideas and the concrete. Everything was material and malleable and could be manipulated.
Well, my dad was convinced that, so even when he was working towards the end of his life, he was convinced. Now, he might have never done it. He probably wouldn't because he wasn't a trained scientist. He was convinced that having this to control and amplify sound as an energy source, he thought he said once the idea is there, he was over the moon. He said, no, this is the rest of it easy. This is just the application. I'm going to change the world of energies. He was set to change the world of energy. No need for this fucking oil nonsense and all this. When he started to be no more wars, and so he wasn't a shrinking violet. But the interesting thing was that once the idea was there, then it was only a matter of time before either he or someone else would put that into fruition. So the most important thing was the imagined idea. and then everything else would fall into place. And that could have been about anything. That could have been about breakfast. That was about large scale things and small scale things. That was the important bit.
It reminds me, I don't know if this has come up in your research or the tours you do or whatever, but there's this trace of Bishop Berkeley's version of idealism where actually it's not idealism in the way of the German idealist philosopher. It's the opposite. It's a very skeptical form of idealism to our eyes, which sees ideas as the real things in the world, and everything is already an idea. And everything is material and concrete in that way, but the idea is the important thing. The concept that just reminded me that's exactly what Berkeley would think. As soon as you have an idea, there's no real distinction anymore between it being real. That it doesn't need to be realized per se.
Going back to Wilde, not just because I have a big interest in him, but in his work De Profundis, his last great work, he discusses the centrality and importance of imagination. He said nothing's possible without this. He said even the idea that a Galilean peasant carpenter can imagine the burden of the world on his shoulder, that alone is the most powerful idea. So what comes from that then is the birth of Christianity. That's the way he sees it. There's definitely an energy, and it's attacking the centre. I think hugely the concept of republic, which he was really proud and in the end and happy to be living in Dublin. It's not coming from a bad place, but I think his way of expressing it is patriotic, and also in terms of, when I saw my dad argue with people in a pub or in outdoors over at geopolitics, he would go nuts. You'd think there's nearly going to be a fight. Like, it wasn't. He didn't think the centre could be the centre or it would rot. So you had to attack it. The example I use, in his eulogy, is that the real word where eccentric comes from ex-centros, which means out of centre. Okay. So Athenians, for example, in the golden era of Athenian democracy, viewed the more people from ex-centros that they had within their society, the stronger that their centre was, because they were being attacked from all angles. So they could absorb some of those attacks and see how you could adapt and change, which meant that that debate is healthy. Eccentric isn't someone wearing, this cool hat and having a Che Guevara t-shirt and a few tattoos. That's, they have to have substance in it. So the substance for me is to be eccentric is really to have a duty to attack in whichever way you can. And they had that in spades, all of them. And I think I was summing my dad's up. I was summing my dad up, but he was the last to die. So he's also representing the rest of them and saying, look, they were state builders, but they were eccentric ones who attacked the centre continuously.